Hey, before we continue on to the next module, I just wanted to point out some of the tools that are available to you to play around with JavaScript and to test your code. I think in the subsequent units I may have you use CodePen, and this is what you're looking at here at CodePen. The URL is codepen.io, and when you set up a CodePen account, you can basically create a pen where you have a panel for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so this is very much a progressive enhancement approach, if you will, where we separate our content from presentation and our logic or our JavaScript. And the way CodePen works is you have a panel for HTML, where if you type the HTML here, then it appears down here, essentially in your browser window, if you will. You have the option to enter CSS in the panel, and then you have a JavaScript panel here. And so you can fool around with JavaScript and your HTML, and you can see the changes almost immediately. Like if I were to change the color of this headline to red, and then save my CodePen, it's automatically saved, but it changes it to red. So I can go back, and instead of it being red, I could change it to white. And so this is a good place to play around. Now here you can see that what I was doing is fooling around with actually my miles per gallon calculator, where I introduced the toFixed method to you guys earlier this week. And we are opening a dialog to display a message that shows the efficiency in miles per gallon. And so at any time you can fool around with a pen, and you can just see your code work in action. So here, if I just go ahead and reload my pen, it's going to appear, and you can see the dialog appears here, and it's asking me for my miles driven. Let's say it's 50, and I click OK and enter the fuel in gallons. Let's say 10. I should get it in 5 miles per gallon. So here it opens up the dialog, and what we're doing is we're working with a window object. So technically we can go back to the pen, and we could type window.alert, and that's almost the same. And see, it starts to execute right away once we press enter or what have you. And that's why I reloaded. But we could type window.alert, oops, and it'll save the changes, and we could pretty much get the same result. And right now, there it goes. It finally saved the pen, and on reload I get basically the same effect. So if I enter 23 here and then 5, then it returns the efficiency. Now again, we're working with a window object, which is very high in the DOM, and then in one of the higher levels, we're working with the actual window and of the browser, if you will. But one of the things that you can also do here is, it's kind of cumbersome to always open up that dialog and have it appear. And so let's say we want to prompt the user to enter the same information, but we want to display it on the page. And so we can type, see, and there it goes, it's executing. Stand by. Document dot write. What am I doing there? So what JavaScript method is that? That's the write method, and it's a method of the document object. and essentially it is a way for us to display content within the body of a page. And so now we've saved it, and if we reload the page, we're going to get pretty much the same thing, right? We'll get the prompt, and we put in our fuel used. This time we get our efficiency, and it's displayed on the page. Now this isn't a very effective method of working with JavaScript, because what we're doing is we're essentially we're delaying the page being completely loaded until we respond to these prompts. And then if there were any content within the page, it would be overwritten using the right method. It would completely replace it. But this is a good place to play around with your code. So now let's take a look at another tool. If you open up a new browser window, you can click, say here in Chrome, on the More button or the ellipsis, and then pull down and select More Tools and the Google Chrome Developer Tools. And we'll revisit these tools off and on within the course. And right now what this I'll cover here is it just contains a variety of tabs. Like here we can go to the Elements tab, and we can actually browse an element within, if you will, the DOM. We can see the structure of this document. The console will show us if there are any errors or warnings. And there are other tabs that we won't take a look at today that don't have any applicability to what we're doing. And so we could play with JavaScript right here in the console. In fact, if I paste the previous script there, and I decide that, well, I want to change this, instead of it being the right method, let's say I go back and I make it alert, but this time I'm actually going to type it incorrectly, and then I'm going to enter, and then let's see what we see. Okay, so the prompts appear, right, and I can enter my mileage and everything, but then I get an error, and so it's telling me that there is a reference error, and it tells me where it is in the script. This is on line 7. We don't see the line numbers, but if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's on line 7. And so if we have an error in our page, it will be displayed that way as well. But if we go back and we change this, and let's use the same alert. Now it gives us code hinting, and then we press enter, then we get the same thing we've been looking at, but we can play around with our code here in the console and actually see if it works. And it will always say undefined on the next line after we press enter. And so the console is a great place where you can fool around with your own code. It's also a place where we can do some debugging within our code. Let's take a look at that. Now, a more realistic sample of, say, conversion and working with data types might be to, say, convert Celsius to Fahrenheit. And so in this page that I have here, I want to convert the temperature in Celsius to Fahrenheit. So if I select 15 degrees and then tab, it's going to show that it's 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's going on back here? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. We can go here to More Tools, and we can go to Developer Tools, and we can take a look at it. And if we want, we can look at the elements, and we can see if we browse this page and look at the document that there is a form, and we have within the form some input fields, both text, one for Celsius, one for Fahrenheit. What's happening here is in line we're calling a function. Now this is something that we'll talk about later. You don't necessarily want to do this. You really want to have something that's called an event listener that's built into your code that actually um, is listening for an event to fire. So for example, we might be looking for the event on change, which means that we tab from one field to the next, and we call this function calcf, which is calculate Fahrenheit, and it's saying calculate Fahrenheit this. So it's using the amount that you put in this object, this input field, as a parameter in the function. We'll talk some more about functions later, but basically it's taking that number just like you would in your head. You can see when we browse it, it's saying, okay, Curtis, take the number 15 and convert it to Fahrenheit. And if we look at the script, we see how this works. We have a don't worry about the function. This declares the function. You can see calcf is here. It's the same name right here. And what this function is doing is every time someone enters a value here and then tabs here, it calculates the conversion. But we've created a variable, but we're using a different method here. See, in the past we create a variable. We might prompt the user, should I say, for that value, right? Prompt them using the prompt method, which is a method of the window object, right? We know that that stalls the page. But what we're doing here, we're using a method of the document object, or document.getElementById. So this is the object. So we're saying within the document, use this method, getElementById, get that element which has the identifier Celsius and whatever value is within that element. Well, here's that element. The identifier is Celsius and the value is currently 15. And then set that value of 15, set Celsius to that value of 15. And then for Fahrenheit, we're going to do the same thing. We have to get the element by ID, which is the text field, right? And then do a little calculation where we declare a variable f and we set it to the conversion for Celsius, because Celsius is basically the temperature in Celsius times 9 divided by 5 plus 32, that is Fahrenheit. And then we use the parse integer function here to parse it out, to make sure that we're dealing with a number. And you might see what I'm doing here is I'm actually logging to the console. So I'm telling the console that I want it to show me the type of object that Celsius is, and the same as I want to know the type of object that F is. And the reason I have that in the code is that when it runs, I want it to log to the console here, so it tells me, kind of like debugging, you know, whether what I really want to know is right here, what should I see? Well, Celsius initially, is it text or a string, right? And then down here, after we calculate temperature Fahrenheit here, var f, is that a string or a number? And that's just logging to the console. That's kind of a debugging thing, and you can do that sometimes in your code, and it doesn't have to be there. You can comment it out or not have it at all. But sometimes if you're working and you're testing your code, you can test it in the console. And then finally, I tell with the script, JavaScript to or the browser to set the Fahrenheit value equal to F. And so what we're doing here in logging in the console is essentially just testing. And so if we go to the console, we can see that it told us this first thing here, the console.log type of Celsius, that is actually a string, and that F is a number. And that's obvious because of what we've done here when we set F to this conversion. We're converting it to an integer, right? And so it's kind of interesting that we can experiment. We can do a little bit of experimenting if we change this and we change Celsius, um, we would see that it would, if we actually, we could change it to an integer and we could see that run. So if I were to open that in brackets, and this is basically an editor, if I were to open it in brackets, and this would actually have to be up here. And I can put it there, and that should take care of it. Now it's going to log it differently. When we reload the page, it should say that they are both numbers. And so if I go back here, let's say that I go to the console and I change it, and let's say I enter the number 50, and I tab, so it shows it as a string and a number, so I didn't do something right here. Let me check and see what I did. So I think it's just because I didn't reload the page. So let me just go ahead and reload it now that I've saved it, and I'll enter a different number. Let's say 4 Celsius is 39, and here we see it's number. So you can use the console for a variety of testing, and you can include it in your code. You don't necessarily have to include it. I know that's quite a bit, and especially when you look at brackets, it looks like holy poop. That sure is a whole lot. But I wanted to introduce you to some tools, and I also wanted to point out that we're going to start moving more and more towards working directly with the DOM and accessing elements and changing those elements using JavaScript versus using a global approach to using the write method and the alert method and the prompt method. And initially I introduce you to those methods so that we can get you kind of oriented to JavaScript syntax and structure, and understand the idea of methods and properties. And so if you have any questions, post them to the questions forum. Don't worry about this if it seems too complex for you. It'll make more and more sense as we progress through this coming week, where we take a look at conditionals and loops and built-in objects. JavaScript's built-in object, the first object we'll look at is an array.